And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you so much for joining us once again. And it's great to have someone I bumped into years ago, whose name I have seen at the Centre for Security Policy, and that is Tommy Waller. Tommy, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, Peter, it's an honor to be on your show.
Great to have you. People can find you there at Lieutenant Colonel Tommy, and obviously at Secure Freedom is the Center for Security Policy handle, both of those on X on Twitter. And he is the president and CEO of Center for Security Policy. And but before that, he served for 2 decades in the US Marines, joined Center for Security Policy in 2014, and is now the president and CEO. Tommy, can I ask you a little bit about tell us a little bit about your military background, and then what led you, whenever you left the military, to end up at the Center for Security Policy?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Peter, I always felt called to serve in the military and the Marines specifically, since the age of 4, really. I mean, my grandparents got me GI Joe pajamas, and to me that was a uniform, and so that's kind of how my mind worked for my entire life. So it's helpful when you feel like your creator has called you to a certain form of service. It makes things simple when it comes to making decisions. And so, yeah, I swore in on my 18th birthday, took an oath to defend the U.S. Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And then it wasn't much later that 9/11 happened. And so I had a goal to become an infantry officer, become an officer that served in the reconnaissance community, specifically the force recon community. And so I was very blessed to be able to have the ability to pursue those goals. And so, Peter, immediately after joining the Marine Corps, I was deployed constantly. And I'm married to the most patient woman ever. Our first 4 years of marriage, I didn't put enough miles on my truck to change the oil. That's how much I was gone between Afghanistan and Iraq. And so, to answer the second part of your question, about halfway through my career, I felt called, and it's a great story. At the time, over beer or something, I could tell you, but it was a God thing. I felt called to leave active duty, and I didn't know what for. And truly, like the day that I just in prayer completely gave it up, like, Lord, I don't know why you called me off of active duty. I was in the reserves at the time, but I was bouncing around between options and turning things down again, trying to really track what does God want me to do. And the day I gave up completely to Him, I got a call about a job I didn't even apply for at the Center for Security Policy. And so that's how I ended up at the Center for Security Policy. And just have had it's really an honor to be able to be part of a team that truly seeks to understand our adversaries. And ultimately, the simple mission is that we provide uncompromised analysis and unconventional solutions to keep Americans safer. And I realize it's not just Americans, but it's anybody who wants freedom, the God-given freedom that we enjoy, that needs to understand those adversaries. And that's what we do.
Can I ask you just a question on the military? What is it like actually being a Christian in the military, in the Marines, not having any clue? Personally, I wanted to join the RAF back when I was younger, and then 9/11 ended that. So that happened in the middle of looking. But when you go into the military with a strong Christian faith, that must be tested in many ways. What was it like or what did it mean for you, maybe, to be a Christian in the military?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so, I will tell you that it was a blessing to have that faith formation beforehand for a lot of reasons. I mean, just the difficulties physically, emotionally, and spiritually when it comes to the type of work that you have to do in the military and in combat. Obviously, it's not to say that somebody who's not Christian, has no place in the service. It's been a benefit to me to have that faith, especially like when you think about just the notion of death, right? Like, so when we put ourselves at risk, we are willing to lay down our life for our brother. That is an unselfishness that is in keeping with what Christ did for all of us. And it gives you a certain amount of confidence to know that if you're doing what's right, if you're at least trying to do what's right every single day, and your life is lost, that this life is only temporary. That's one aspect. I always tried to be as respectful to anyone surrounding me with respect to religious faith. Lots of people don't believe in God at all, and it's not up to me to compel them to believe. But what I tried to do was to just lead by example. That's the Marine Corps officer motto, ductus or ductus exemplo, which is Latin for lead by example. And so it was a situation where I always, I would ask before missions, anybody got any issue with us, praying beforehand? No issue? Okay, chaplain, come in. If we had a chaplain, if not, I would ask for volunteers. It was never compelling people to do it, but rather just inviting it. And what I found was that it every time you invite it properly, it was helpful to the entire team. Towards the end of my career, at my last billet, my last assignment was as the commander of the one independent reserve force recon company. And I would tell you that being a Christian in the ranks of the military in 2021 became exceptionally difficult. My career ended over the Biden administration's vaccine mandate, and as I reflect back on it, Peter, what I noticed is that was a very, very highly effective methodology for harvesting the data on strongly held religious beliefs within the Department of Defense. And once they had that data, it was an exceptionally well executed purge of those who put their faith above anything else. And it was also, I can talk about that for a long time if you want, but it was also a test. It was a test to see specifically among officers who would violate the law, and violate their conscience to participate in that mandate. And so I didn't violate my conscience. I didn't violate my law. I didn't violate my faith, but it ended my career.
Well, I want to talk to you about energy, and maybe we will revisit that. It's fascinating to talk to someone who has served, and the 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 vaccine mandates and how that's affected you, and many others in the military. It'd be interesting to see President Trump seems to want to restore individuals to positions who were forced out, not only in the military but wider. And so that's a really interesting conversation, and even what it was like to be in the military as the whole woke agenda has come further and further. But I'll put that on the back burner
Sure.
for the next time. But can I ask, m- before we get on the energy, for you moving from someone in the military uh, behind the scenes and now moving to working in an organization based in DC, a public organization, many political contacts, media engagements. It's a public facing organization. What was it like for you kind of making that transition from the privacy of the military to the publicity of a think tank like this?
Yeah, well, Peter, it's for me. I mean, it is a challenge. It's a different environment, right? I mean, my background in the Marines was in the recon community, right? So like swift, silent, and deadly, behind the scenes, nobody knows, but where we are, who we are, what we're doing. And so you go from that to the public side. I mean, look, I've still got a long ways to go, right? I mean, I don't even have much of a Twitter following, right? That's going to grow, I'm sure, at some point. The important thing is that there's also still, as part of our work at the Center for Security Policy, there's a public facing side, and then there's also still the recon side. There's still a lot that goes on in the background. And in fact, probably the single most important thing I did for the security of the United States in uniform was actually very similar to what I do out of uniform for the Center for Security Policy in relation to what you just asked on grid security. And so because of my civilian job, right? So I was, recruited and hired to work at the Center for Security Policy. It wasn't long that I was here. First started off studying jihad, Sharia, the global jihad network, and getting understanding of the adversaries I faced on the battlefield, but that I never understood. I never understood why they did what they did. What separated them from, say, my interpreters. I had interpreters who were phenomenal. They some gave their lives for us. They didn't want to live under that doctrine. After an initial period of working in that area, one of the Center for Security Policy's founders, Frank Gaffney, had sat me down and said, "Hey, look, I want to teach you about electromagnetic pulse. It's a threat to our energy, electric infrastructure." People like Frank, who worked in the Pentagon back during the Cold War, they knew about this stuff, but it was highly classified, and it had just become unclassified in 2004. So Frank, taught me about that, and he said, "Look, I want you to lead our nationwide secure the grid coalition, right? The electric grid. And so what that did, Peter, is it put me in touch with the world's foremost experts on and matters pertaining to security of the electric grid. And that's exactly why during the first Trump administration, I was asked to serve on a very important task force of the U.S. Air Force focused on those electromagnetic spectrum threats like EMP. And so the most important thing I ever did in uniform as a Marine was not even for the Marine Corps, it was for the Air Force. And it had everything to do with energy security and protecting our most critical infrastructure. And that's that's maybe explains a little bit about how I went back and forth between these two worlds. At the time, Peter, when I did that work, when I was asked to do that work, it was all behind the scenes. I ran it through the ethics folks, the Marine Corps. And I should say real quick, Center for Security Policy, the way we are able to have uncompromised analysis about what threatens our republic and threatens the freedom of Americans and our allies is we don't take a dime from the government, from any foreign sources or any special interest, any company that can profit off of our recommendations. So from an ethics perspective, it was very easy for the US government and the DoD to say, yeah, you can go serve on this task force because of your civilian job and the expertise you have there. There's no way for the Center for Security Policy to make a dime off of that. It's purely in the public interest. And so, yeah, Peter, I'd be happy to talk all about why the center and why Frank Gaffney has always cared about the grid and why the Center for Security Policy continues to focus on that.
And Frank obviously knows very much how money is used to manipulate and influence with foreign powers using that. So it's great to hear you saying how aware you are of that, and that's the reason why you maybe don't rush to other sources that others go to for funding. Now, I want to get on the EMPs, but just a general question before we delve into looking at the electricity grid and how it's set up and security. But is America actually energy secure? It's a big question. I will pick off bits, but just that general, is America energy secure?
No. The short answer is absolutely not. America could be, right? And so when you think about energy security, there's a lot of aspects that come to it. So we will most likely focus most of this on electricity infrastructure, but obviously you have energy in the form of fuel. You know, the last 4 years of the Biden administration, it seemed as though it was a purposeful wrecking operation on domestic energy production with respect to fuel specifically, where we found ourselves, instead of creating our own and harvesting and doing that domestically and being able to export it, we found ourselves in a position where the Biden administration drained our petroleum reserves, our strategic petroleum reserves. It put the nation in a position where we were importing oil from nations that are adversarial to the United States, when we have an abundance of energy resources that we could develop on our own. So that's on the fuel side. But with respect to the energy security part that I've had a specific focus on, that would be on the electric infrastructure. Unfortunately, Peter, to answer your question, no, we're not secure there either. And a lot of that was unfortunately the Biden administration suspending and removing actions that the previous Trump administration had taken to try to secure our electric infrastructure. And so it put us in a position where we used to have what we would say is 4 major threat vectors to our electric grid. We now have 6. The last 2 were specifically added by the Biden administration, and now President Trump is in a position to try to fix that. And so I'd be happy to talk about those 6 threat vectors, but maybe even first, just a discussion about why is the grid so important in the first place?
No, because when I was looking, I delved a little bit into this. Always good for you, someone on to understand a little bit, and we. Here in the UK, we've got a massive problem in terms of lack of investment. Now, it's not just the electricity grid or energy; that's kind of across the board on many areas. And I know the US has suffered massive lack of investment in transportation and all that goes with that, but also in the electricity grid. And energy is vital. The cost and availability of energy decides whether a country will actually succeed or not. And here in Europe, in the UK, we've got, I think, the highest energy costs in the West. But looking at the grid, it's kind of the US. It's not one central. It seems to be divided up into separate parts in different parts of the country.
Yeah, so in the United States, there's three major what they call interconnections: the Eastern interconnection, the Western interconnection, and then Texas has its own. It's called ERCOT, its own interconnection.
It sounds
And
usual, Texas having its own, yes.
right, right, and look, I mean, Texas has the ability to do it better and faster than anyone else. In fact, I'm literally flying to Austin tomorrow for 2 days for some really critical briefings of the legislators, Public Utility Commission, the people that operate the ERCOT grid about this very topic we're talking about. And that's one of the things I'm just going to remind them. Like, you can fix it and protect it faster than anywhere else in the world. You can also wreck it faster than anywhere else in the world. And so that independence comes with both the opportunity and the risk, depending on what they decide to do. But ultimately, those three interconnections, they are connected in certain places, but that's how the American grid is essentially broken up. But the reality is that all three of those interconnections are vulnerable to these six threat vectors that really would threaten any grid anywhere if you're not paying attention to them.
Can I ask just before I jump onto that about the the size of it? Well, how does Texas have its own? Because the US is one landmass, therefore it's not a state by state issue. It may be in terms of where power plants are placed, but in terms of the grid, it kind of crosses over those state boundaries. So how is kind of Texas? How does that have its own, which is different from the others?
So the way that the when we say electric grid, I should have just mentioned, when we say grid, what we're talking about is all the infrastructure associated with generating electricity, transmitting it, and then distributing it for it to be used. Now, that could be we're talking about interconnection level, like the Eastern and Western and Texas grid. Inside of that space, you have lots of forms of generation. You could have nuclear, you could have coal, fossil fuel, natural gas, solar, wind, etc. And in general, all of that generation and then the transmission is the infrastructure that takes it long distances. You think about, you don't have big coal plants or nuclear plants right next to populated areas. A lot of the like wind and solar generation are far away from populated areas. So that transmission infrastructure has to transport the electricity. And then the distribution part of the grid, which is about 90% of the actual infrastructure, that is what you see when you drive around and you see, small substations and power lines and small transformers. That's distribution. So when we say the grid, we mean all of that. Now, could you have a microgrid? Yes. If you had on your home solar panels and a battery storage and inverter system, that's a grid. It's just a tiny little microgrid, right? It generates electricity, and it gets it where it needs to go to be used. But the bulk power system in the United States is separated between those three. Now, how did Texas get its own? How did the Eastern and Western interconnections? Honestly, Peter, it just got built out over time from cities, and it expanded. And at some point, the people of Texas and the state said, we want to have our own, right? Which is common among Texas. And so in terms of the regulations, the federal government has less jurisdiction over Texas than it does on the Eastern and Western interconnection. And our argument has been that's good for Texas, because generally speaking, the federal government hasn't been focused adequately on security like it should. So our consistent message to Texas, and it's what I'm going to say again the next 2 days, is you can set the standard for the rest of the country because you can do it faster. You're unencumbered by the government's standards, which are just catastrophically insufficient for security.
So does that mean on a state like California, I guess, where maybe there would be more regulation, it's going to be much more difficult to build out than somewhere like Texas? Because I read that the cost of actually upgrading the grid is like 2.5 trillion. I think by 2035, it's a huge endeavor, and obviously some states are better prepared or need less work than others. But I guess, yes, when you go in a state with more regulation, then it becomes more cumbersome, more expensive, more difficult. And then I guess the states have to pay even more tax to cover that.
So I think you just bring up a pretty good example that we can talk about, Texas and California. And let's just look at one part of this, right? When it comes to regulation, because I will just tell you in general, our preference is fewer government control regulations in general. Okay. On the other hand, when it comes to security and safety, there's a purpose there. Let's look at California and Texas. So California has been pushing renewables for a very long time, to the point where they've had this notion that, oh, we get all this energy from renewables. A lot of it they literally have had to import electricity from other states, like Wyoming, for example, because they physically can't produce enough for their population, and especially can't produce enough just with renewables. Let me also state, Peter, I'm not anti-renewable. When I say renewable, I'm saying it. Maybe I should just say wind and solar, okay? Because there's another type of renewable that we have been pushing for years, and it's called nuclear. It's a whole nother discussion, which we probably should get into, but nuclear fuel, spent nuclear fuel, is a renewable. You can recycle it. In fact, for the United States, we have 250 years worth of clean carbon-free electricity that's already been mined, and it's at nuclear sites across the country in casks. It's spent nuclear fuel. It can be recycled, repurposed in fast reactors to produce electricity. It's something that we've promoted for years, and the Biden administration ignored, and I'm hoping the Trump administration doesn't. But when I say renewables, what I'm saying is like wind and solar. I'm not anti-wind and solar. In fact, at a localized level for your home, for like a building, small community, it is a great piece of resilience to be able to produce and store your own energy locally. Now, California and Texas, they were doing it and have been doing it at scale. California has more regulations. It does take longer for that process to go through, for the planning and for the government to take a look at, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to build it out? How can it be safe? How can it be secure and good for the environment? Look recently at the gigantic lithium ion factory battery fire in California, and for the absolute environmental and health catastrophe that's probably going to spell out, even despite California trying to do a good job of looking at these things through regulation. Texas is kind of a free-for-all when it comes to the wind and solar and battery. It's a free market, okay, which generally speaking, I'm all for free market, okay? But what you have right now are places in Texas where you're about to have grid operators put big, gigantic battery energy storage sites, the BESS systems, all over that state, some of which are going to be potentially stuck right on top of gigantic pipeline systems, right? And these are assets that once they catch fire, you can't do anything. You just have to watch it burn, okay? And that's what no regulation or almost no regulation gets you. So there's got to be at some point some ability from a security, safety, environmental aspect, for the sake of the public interest, to look at energy security, at grid security, and at things like we're talking about. And so what we try to do at the Center for Security Policy is to figure out where's that sweet spot for the sake of the public interest, right? And because we don't have, battery companies or EMP hardening companies or utility companies paying us, we can look out for the public.
Tell me, you talked about nuclear. It's interesting, the debate we're having in the UK, nuclear. Sadly, we can't actually build anything ourselves. So we actually had to turn to France, and that was paid by Chinese money. I think it gets very complicated, hugely expensive. But France obviously is a nation that's focused on nuclear, where other countries haven't. Does the US, and I know that President Trump has highlighted the stupidity of buying solar panels from another country, from China, or when you buy wind turbines, we in the UK buy them from the Netherlands. And so it's not even that you have your manufacturing in your own country. What about the US? This push to America First manufacturing back in the US, in terms of building nuclear plants or others, is it possible to actually base that manufacturing within the US?
Yeah, Peter, it's going to be possible, but it's not going to be easy. Okay, so for example, when you look at things like big high voltage transformers, they use a certain type of steel, grain oriented electrical steel. Well, guess what China did for decades? They dumped that into the market to put every other producer possible out of business, right? And so there's a lot of intricacies about domestic manufacturing that the Chinese Communist Party had been looking at for years, and through their unrestricted warfare doctrine, exploiting every opportunity they could. But I believe truly, Peter, where there's a will, there's a way, right? And so if the American people, if we have a will to do it, we can figure out how to do it. Certainly, in President Trump, we have a leader who's got a lot of will in a lot of ways. I think it's a miracle that he wasn't killed in Pennsylvania on that day, right? And I think he realizes that, so he knows, he's like, I've got to do as much as I can, for the sake of our country and our allies and our freedom, and so, but it's going to take the American people making some sacrifices. Look, Peter, I own a little Cajun cookware company. I'm from South Louisiana, and we have, it's called the Oyster Bed. We got some great culinary cookware that we invented. And for the longest time, it's been manufactured in Mexico. Good partners. I would never go to China. Okay. But with what President Trump is doing, it creates the opportunity to bring it back to the United States. And that's exactly what we're doing too. Right. And so that's going to be for companies all over this country. But the most important, it's one thing if, you want to charbroil oysters or cook a nice steak on a piece of cookware where it's made. It's another thing when it's an electric transformer that controls the grid that you depend on for life, and you're having it made in China, for example. And we know that some of these assets that have been made in China have hardware backdoors. They have vulnerabilities baked into the design. So I think across the board, what you're going to see is President Trump bringing as much back to the United States when it comes to domestic manufacturing. But for things related to our national security, that is where it's the absolute most important.
Tell me about how kind of the vulnerabilities in the electrical grid. There have been numerous stories under Biden's regime of China gaining influence in many areas, and I'm sure it's been in energy, as that is one of the most critical infrastructure areas of any nation. But what about how is that infrastructure protected, whether it's by cyber attack or physical means? How do you go about making sure that grid is intact and can withstand any attacks?
Yeah. So, Peter, this gets into those threat vectors. So we'll say that we're gonna go over all six of them, and you just teed it up with the Biden administration. So traditionally, there was just four that we focused on when I first started this work. When Frank kind of briefed me up on the various threats, and the last two that were added are one, our own government policies. Okay. So we may suffer blackouts and brownouts because of our government has decided to electrify everything, electric vehicles and charging stations and all these things, and not and build out and try to build out all this grid infrastructure while simultaneously shutting down baseload power generators like nuclear and coal and fossil fuel, with this fantasy that you can make it all with wind and solar and these quote battery energy storage sites. It's fantasy. So we may suffer blackouts literally from our own government policies. That theoretically should be easy to reverse, right? The second one that's gotten worse, particularly under the Biden administration, is the supply chain. So when you have really critical items like transformers, for example, when I first started this work, these large transformers, it was a lead time of about 18 months, right? 18, 24 months. Now, depending on what size transformer, you're looking at 4 to 6 years to make one, and it's custom made for the grid. And so, and when you are importing these from other countries, they can put vulnerabilities in those assets, right? Besides the fact that just if they go down in large numbers, you just can't make them fast enough and get them overseas, right? And so, and this gets into some of the other threats that we have to defend against, because, for example, these transformers, they're very hard to replace and they're vulnerable to different types of attacks. So supply chain would be one. Okay. If you get it made overseas in another country that's hostile and they bake in things to destroy it or remotely turn it off, that's a problem. But they can also be vulnerable to the other things, Peter, that you mentioned: physical sabotage, cyber attack, and then electromagnetic attack, EMP, which could be both from humans, but it can also occur naturally from the sun.
Tell me about the I won't touch on that, but when you talked about getting the transformer specially made, is there not a level of commonality across the whole electrical grid? Because if there was, obviously that would make sense and be able to reduce costs, and you could have one factory based in the US. Is it a hodgepodge kind of together, as opposed to, oh well, we need transformers, we can order 100 or 50 substations? Those all have to be different, do they?
It's a hodgepodge, right? Yeah, there is some commonality. So, for example, like in Texas, they decided for the ERCOT grid a certain level of the transformer size that they were not going to go above, and so there's some standardization across that grid with respect to the size of those transformers. Now, they are going above those now for large build outs to get. We talk about how they got generation that's way far away from the populated sites that they needed, right? So let's just say in Texas, in that example, you have these gigantic wind farms and solar farms that are way out in the western part of the state, and the population centers are further east. They have to transmit that electricity. Okay, so this is going to help us. This is going to help your audience understand one of the next vulnerabilities, the electromagnetic spectrum vulnerabilities, and specifically the connection between solar weather and nuclear EMP, nuclear electromagnetic pulse. So say you've got a form of generation, whatever it is. It could be coal, nuclear, but in this case, it's generally solar and wind, way out in West Texas. And you got to get that electricity way over to the east in Houston, Dallas, wherever the people live, okay? You have to transmit it. To transmit it, it's got to go long distances. To go long distances, you have to increase the voltage, right? So high voltage. Well, what is high voltage? Low resistance. High voltage, low resistance, okay? And so when you build out this infrastructure that connects, these almost irreplaceable assets, a step-up transformer, right? So electricity is generated, and then its voltage is stepped up really high to transmit it over a long distance to where it's going to be distributed. Those transformers that step it up and step it down are critical to that operating. You can't operate the grid without them. It's like the backbone of the grid, okay? Well, they are vulnerable, yes, to cyber attacks, yes, to physical sabotage. You shoot them up with a rifle, right? And there's other ways that I'm not going to talk about that you could damage them or destroy them. But electromagnetic spectrum attack, and this comes from the sun or a nuclear weapon detonated up in the exoatmosphere. When the sun produces a coronal mass ejection, right? People say a solar flare. What you see is a solar flare. You observe that, but behind it is this highly charged particles that go out into space, and they connect with the Earth. Our Earth has a magnetosphere, and the magnetosphere heaves and wobbles and moves, right? And anytime you have a magnetosphere that moves, it creates electromagnetic energy. So even when if you pull start a motor like in a lawnmower or something like that, that magnet surrounded by copper wire, the movement, when you pull, it moves that magnetosphere and it generates electromagnetic energy, electricity that goes down to the spark plug. Well, a solar storm, a geomagnetic disturbance that goes through space and connects with the Earth and our magnetosphere, makes it move, heave, and wobble, generates electromagnetic energy into the crust of the Earth beneath our feet. And it happens all over the UK, all over the United States, especially in the northern hemispheres. And this electromagnetic energy, this electricity, what is it always looking for? The path of least resistance, right? So now imagine those long transmission lines from West Texas to East Texas or wherever. Could be over the UK, could be all over Europe. Low resistance, high voltage. That ground-induced current is looking for a path of least resistance, and it jumps up right through the neutral ground wire of a transformer. It travels down those wires to that next transformer, and it fries it, catastrophically ruins it, right? And that's something, Peter, if we don't protect against, globally, every country that has long transmission lines and transformers is vulnerable to this, every single nation. And if we don't protect against it, it's 100% chance that we're going to lose our grid and lose electricity, because we, at some point, Earth will connect with one of those solar storms. We just don't know when, right? And so anyway, so that's one way to describe a vulnerability to of a very important critical asset to something that can occur naturally from the sun, or it can occur from a nuclear weapon up in space. And that's another topic I'd be happy to talk about if you want, because that's exactly what I was working on with the Air Force.
Okay, I mean, go into that because obviously a solar flare, that's a natural EMP, but then the concerns is it will be used by a rogue nation or an unfriendly country as a form of weaponry to attack.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, it was something that both the United States and the Soviets discovered. We started testing nuclear weapons. They would test them out in the desert and on the ground, right? Ground burst. And what they found was that any conductor that connected with the blast, the fireball, would create this pulse, this electromagnetic pulse. So they had mock towns and cities out there where, they would have a town built in the desert and another town. They would nuke one of the towns. Well, they'd be connected by grid infrastructure, electric infrastructure, just like we have in every modern country. And they would see what happens, right? And what would happen is any of those wires that connected with that fireball, with that blast, would be highly electrified, and it would produce a pulse that would ruin, the assets in the nearby town. What they hypothesized, Peter, was that if they launched these nuclear weapons and detonated them up in space, like 30 kilometers or higher in the exoatmosphere, they hypothesized it would produce a pulse as well. They had no idea how strong that pulse would be. And so what happened is when the United States and when the Soviets tested these nuclear weapons in the exoatmosphere, both sides discovered this incredible weapon against electric infrastructure. And then they signed the Atmospheric Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Said we won't test these anymore because they were also ruining satellites up in low Earth orbit. And then it became a highly classified, super secret weapon all the way until 2004 when it was declassified, right? And so now we know about electromagnetic pulse, EMP. We know what it can do. The Russians, they tested it over populated areas. The United States, we tested about 800 or 900 miles from Hawaii over the Pacific Ocean, and it turned the lights off in Hawaii. The Russians tested it over Kazakhstan, over a populated area. Why? Because it was the exact geomagnetic latitude and longitude of Washington, D.C. on the other side of the globe, right? And so the test data we got from them is the most authoritative. At the end of the Cold War, some of the Soviet scientists defected. They provided the test data to the Congressional EMP Commission, and we now know what that risk is, right? And that's any modern civilization that relies on electricity can be attacked through EMP to take down that grid. And everything we rely on as a modern civilization requires electricity. And every one of our adversaries, Peter, every one of our adversaries knows this. So we've got to protect it.
Tell me about the push to renewable. And it's interesting. On one side, you've got drill, baby, drill from Trump. On the other side, you've got the first buddy, Elon Musk, wanting to push towards renewables. And yet we just had a storm here in England a couple of weeks ago, and the biggest solar farm was utterly destroyed. So that is vulnerable because if you've got a power plant, then it's this hunking big structure which can withstand wind. But you also seem to have the vulnerability on the renewable side of having the batteries, because if you have a nuclear power station, I assume it just pumps out energy non-stop day and night. It's not when the sun is turned off at night, then you lose your power, your solar panels, you need your batteries. And that the batteries seem to be also a vulnerability, but a huge extra cost into the chain, the electricity chain.
Yeah, the batteries are a huge cost. And guess what, Peter? It's not just the upfront cost. It's the cost when it's time for those batteries, no battery lasts forever. Okay. So you're looking at 150% of what the initial cost would be for the landowner to have to dispose of those battery, the grid size, battery electric, storage systems, energy storage systems afterwards. So, and that's one of the things these counties in Texas, they're having a look. The people are like, whoa, hold on a second. All these, all this subsidy, there's been a huge trough of subsidized, money that these companies are grabbing. The government, during the Biden administration, through the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, pumped all kinds of money into this, and it's being clawed at by all these companies. And what's going to end up happening is there's going to be these battery, energy storage systems that are for grid size storage built out, and the landowners in the counties, however many years when there's no longer any capacity to be able to run those things, they're going to have to dispose of that. And that's if they don't catch on fire and cause an environmental catastrophe. The introduction of wind and solar to the big bulk electric grid has been something that has caused a lot of issues because of the intermittent power that you talked about. When the sun's shining and the wind's blowing, it's producing power. It's not when it's not. The grid has to be balanced, and so if you're looking at specifically how do you make the grid as efficient as possible, it would be through baseload power generators that, as you mentioned before, nuclear, it's on at a level, baseload level that you can predict all the time. And you have a maintenance cycle out that you can predict when it's going to need the fuel rods to be replaced, right? The nuclear power industry in the United States is the safest industry that's out there. There are some vulnerabilities that we are concerned about with respect to spent nuclear fuel, but there's also opportunities. And so one of the things our Center for Security Policy has done consistently is we have, looked at what are the vulnerabilities and how do you fix them, petition the government and the industry to fix those, and then also really proposed the idea of using nuclear, right? Because you now have the technology out there to be able to have microgrids powered by small modular and micro reactors, and those could use as a source of fuel the spent, slightly used nuclear fuel from all of our present light water reactor fleet. And so, Peter, when you look at the fuel that's used for our light water reactors in the United States, about 94 to 95% of the energy is still remaining in those fuel rods when they expire enough to have that reactor function. And they have to store those for like 1 million years, right? Or we could just recycle it and use it in fast reactors, micro and modular reactors that can be designed to be, resistant to physical sabotage and cyber attack and hardened against electromagnetic pulse. These are the things that we're promoting. That produces baseload power that's predictable, safe, and secure, and it's clean and carbon free, right? The renewables like wind and solar, my personal perspective on it is it has a place, and that place is at the localized level where the demand for electricity can be met by wind, solar, and battery, right? Homes, buildings, apartment complexes where it's local right there. As soon as you start to try to do massive, like you just said, this gigantic solar farm that got devastated by a hailstorm, because gigantic investment like that, now you have all of the infrequency of intermittent power being placed on the grid, and now you have a potential vulnerability that is a gigantic investment that you can't, you're going to have to deal with when it breaks, right? So anyway, I don't know if that helps kind of explain just my own personal professional perspective on it. For the grid, we really need to push nuclear, micro, and small modular reactors that are all hazard secure, and build that out to get rid of the gigantic bulk power system that we have that depends on all this vulnerable infrastructure. But in the meantime, we got to protect what we've got, and that's exactly what I'll be promoting tomorrow in Texas, and to anybody who will listen.
Let me just finish off with I think Chris Wright is now the Energy Secretary. I think the Senate has confirmed him as another one of President Trump's cabinet picks. But what are the things in his tray that he has to deal with? It's all well and good, drill baby drill, but there are other parts of that infrastructure that need to be in place. So for you,
Yeah.
what do you think the most important things are in his tray that he has to deal with?
So for me, it's going to be protect the grid you have right now from the known hazards and do what the Biden administration refused to do. So I'll give you one example. We talked before, Peter, about the threat of solar weather or nuclear EMP and those ground-induced currents that can catastrophically ruin those transformers that are irreplaceable, right? The cost for the entire United States of America to fix that problem, and you should know that the solution exists. It's been tested. It's been around for 10 years, neutral ground blockers that just block that current, okay? I personally briefed the last Secretary of Energy multiple times and pleaded with her The cost would have been 1/3 of 1% of the Biden infrastructure bill, which was like 1.2 trillion. It's about 4 billion for the entire United States of America to protect against that threat. And we know with certainty that at some point that threat will manifest itself and take the grid down. And so one recommendation for the new secretary will be to take all of the recommendations we made to the last secretary and take them seriously, right? So any money that is left over from the infrastructure bill or the Inflation Reduction Act that the Biden administration was pushing towards the renewable trough, seize it immediately and make the investment on the things we know with certainty are going to happen at some point to protect the grid. That would be one. But another would be to go back to the days that the Trump administration passed an executive order, May 1st, 2020, declared a grid security emergency because of Chinese manufactured transformers in the American grid. So it would be figure out a crash course on domestic manufacturing of critical grid components like transformers. And when you do it, you make sure that they're designed in such a way that they are resilient to both these cyber and electromagnetic spectrum threats, right? You bake the design, you bake the protection into the design, and you manufacture it in the United States. And take the money the Biden administration had planned to spend on the Green New Deal, you seize it and you use it to do these things here in America. Those would be just two very quick examples, but we have lots. So.
They all had, the whole cabinet have lots of things in each of their in tray. Tommy, I really appreciate you coming on. Tommy, President and CEO of Center for Security Policy, and the website centerforsecuritypolicy.org. All the links will be in the description, whether you're watching or listening on any of the podcasting apps. But Tommy, I really appreciate your time. Good to have you on. A very important topic, and thank you for giving us your expert analysis.
Definitely. Yeah, Peter, thank you for having me on.